They came wrapped in wax paper or tin foil, tucked next to a bruised apple and a chipped thermos. Peanut butter on bread so stale it cracked. Bologna so thin it was practically a rumor. But these sandwiches got working men through the day, and they deserve to be remembered. Lard and salt sandwich. It was a sandwich that didn't whisper luxury. It shouted survival. In the rural stretches of America, especially the South and parts of Appalachia, lard was more than a cooking fat. It was sustenance in a jar. When meat was scarce and butter too expensive, folks would smear thick layers of pork lard onto stale slices of white bread, sometimes warmed just enough to soften, then sprinkle on salt for taste. The bread was often homemade or store-bought at a discount rack, day-old, maybe mold-trimmed. This sandwich had no fancy name, but for the working poor, it filled bellies and kept the body going for hours of farm work, factory shifts, or walking long distances. Some added cracked black pepper, a dash of vinegar, or a sliver of onion, if the garden allowed it. Kids sometimes brought them to school, wrapped in wax paper or newspaper. It was greasy, heavy, and left a white film on the fingers. But it was calories. It was comfort. And above all, it was cheap. It told the story of a family doing the best they could with the scraps life handed them. And despite its humble ingredients, there was something oddly warming about it. Like the fat itself carried the memory of the hog butchering season, smokehouses, and kinfolk gathered around a wood stove in winter. Bread and lard with salt. There was nothing fancier than the way you learned to survive. Bread and lard with salt was survival dressed in simplicity. A thick slice of bread, stale or fresh, it didn't matter, slathered with a cold smear of lard from the tin in the icebox. Not butter, not margarine, just fat. You sprinkled a few grains of salt across the top, ate it slow, ate it fast. Ate it because that was what there was. There wasn't a recipe. There wasn't a debate. It was a meal born of hardship and hardened hands, the kind that didn't ask for flavor as much as it asked for calories. And when it went down, it reminded you, full is full. Cold spaghetti sandwich. Back then, leftovers didn't sit quietly in Tupperware waiting to be forgotten. They got slapped between slices of bread and became tomorrow's lunch. Cold spaghetti, sauce and all, was no exception. You'd take yesterday's noodles, stiff and tangled into little matted clumps, and lay them out across white sandwich bread like some kind of red-smeared haystack. Maybe a shake of Parmesan dusted over the top if you were lucky, or a slice of American cheese to bind it together. Most of the time, though, it was just cold pasta, tomato sauce, and bread. Kids brought it to school wrapped in wax paper. Factory workers ate it in the cab of a truck. It was messy, sure, sauce squeezing out the sides, staining fingers and lunch bags. But it was filling, and it was normal. Nobody flinched. Today it might seem like a joke, the kind of thing you'd see on a food challenge show. But for people living through layoffs, strikes, and months with more bills than paychecks, cold spaghetti sandwiches were just what you did. No shame, no waste, just leftovers turned into fuel. Cornmeal fried fish, caught locally. When you couldn't afford the butcher, you went to the river. Bluegill, catfish, perch. Whatever bit the line that day went into the skillet. You cleaned them quick, dusted them in seasoned cornmeal, and dropped them into a cast-iron pan full of hot oil. They fried fast, crispy on the outside, flaky inside. Served with hush puppies or a scoop of grits, it was a meal born from the water and a little grit. Cornmeal fried fish didn't need sauce. It needed time, a sharp knife, and enough oil to do the job right. When dinner hit the table, it didn't last long. Fried bologna sandwich. If you grew up poor in mid-century America, chances are you've heard the sputter of bologna hitting a hot, greasy pan. It would curl up at the edges like a tiny hat, the middle bubbling like a drum. Fried bologna wasn't glamorous, but it was the next best thing to steak for families counting every dime. It came in giant pink tubes from the deli counter or discount bins, sliced thick or thin, depending on how generous the grocer was feeling that day. You'd toss it into a skillet with a bit of leftover bacon grease or lard, slap it between two pieces of white bread, sometimes toasted if the stove was already hot, and maybe dress it with a smear of mustard or a slice of government cheese if you were feeling rich. In steel towns, mining camps, and inner cities alike, this sandwich became a staple of factory lunch pails and after-school snacks. The smell of sizzling bologna was unmistakable, salty, greasy, mouth-watering. In a way only hunger can exaggerate. It didn't need lettuce or artisan buns. It needed heat, bread, and the willingness to pretend you were eating something better. And often it was, because it tasted like home, like making do, like being fed by someone who loved you enough to get creative with very little. Cabbage fritters. Cabbage fritters weren't fancy. They were desperation fried up, golden and crisp. You started with what you had: a withering head of cabbage, some flour, a few tablespoons of bacon grease, maybe one egg if you could spare it. You shredded the cabbage fine, stirred it into a loose, sticky batter, and dropped fat spoonfuls onto a hot skillet. They sputtered in the grease, smelling sharp and green and alive. You flattened them with the back of your spoon, pressing them hard into the pan so they crisped at the edges. No fancy sauces, no careful plating, just a plate stacked with hot fritters, greasy at the edges, heavy enough to keep a man moving through a winter shift. If there was vinegar, you splashed it over the top. If not, you ate them plain, hot, rough, and good enough to make the house smell like there was something worth sitting down for. Cabbage fritters didn't cost much, but they gave you the sense, for a few minutes, that you were still doing all right, still making dinner happen, still finding a way. Creamed corn sandwich. There was a time when canned creamed corn was everywhere, on tables, in casseroles, poured over biscuits. But one of its lesser-known roles was between bread. 2 slices of white sandwich bread, usually untoasted, soaked up a generous spoonful of cold or room-temperature creamed corn. It oozed out the sides, slippery and bright yellow. The bread went soggy fast, so you had to eat it quick, no dawdling. This wasn't a sandwich made for presentation. It was born from a single can, meant to feed 6 people, spread thin across whatever starch was available. If the corn was warm, it felt like comfort. If it was cold, it was necessity. School kids ate it at lunchtime. Working men ate it while walking to the bus stop. Sometimes it was paired with a slice of tomato or a thin sheet of onion, but even plain, it served its purpose. Fill the belly, don't break the bank. Nowadays, the thought of a corn sandwich might make someone queasy. But then again, most people today haven't stood in front of a cabinet with only 1 can and a loaf of bread and had to make it work. Mashed potato pancakes. Leftover mashed potatoes weren't thrown out. They were transformed. Mashed potato pancakes were second-day salvation, a meal built from scraps that tasted better than most things made fresh. You started with cold, stiff mashed potatoes, lumpy, buttery, maybe a little dry. Stir in an egg if you had one, a spoonful of flour, and a pinch of salt. Some folks added chopped onions. Others tossed in a handful of cheese or herbs when they were lucky. You formed the mixture into thick, heavy patties and laid them into a hot, greased skillet. The outside crisped up golden and crackly. while the inside stayed soft and creamy. The smell alone was enough to pull kids to the kitchen like a dinner bell. No need for sides, just a stack of hot cakes, maybe a dab of sour cream or a shake of pepper on top. They were cheap, filling, and made from nothing new. But when your fork cracked through that crust into the steaming middle, it didn't feel like leftovers. It felt like a quiet little miracle. Fried salt pork with grits. Salt pork was never the main event. It was the seasoning, the edge, the crackle. But if you had a thick slice and some grits to go with it, you had dinner. You sliced the salt pork into thick slabs, tossed them in a hot skillet, and waited until they blistered and curled. The fat rendered out, filling the pan with flavor. While that sizzled, grits simmered on the back burner, slow cooked, salted just enough, and stirred until they were smooth as cream. When the pork was done, you poured the hot fat into the grits, stirred once, and plated the meat right on top. It was salty, rich, and hot. Grits soaked up every drop, and the pork added just enough chew to remind you there was meat involved. No one left hungry? Not that night. Mashed potato sandwich. Leftovers never went to waste, not when mouths outnumbered dollars. After supper, the cold, mashed potatoes went back into the icebox. By noon the next day, they became the core of a mashed potato sandwich. Thick slabs of bread cradled a scoop of cold, salted mashed spuds, sometimes smeared with mustard or topped with an onion slice. It was starchy, heavy, and oddly comforting. Some days, a crust of gravy clung to the potato and made it feel like more than scraps. This was a lunchbox favorite for mill workers, coal miners, and school kids alike. Easy to make, cheap to pack, and dense with enough carbs to keep the belly full. It wasn't elegant, but it did the job. Some toasting the bread gave it contrast. Others preferred it soft. It often showed up on Mondays, when Sunday's roast was long gone, but the potatoes lived on. The sandwich was a quiet reminder that in hard times, food was circular. Nothing ended. It just changed shape. Leftovers were sacred, and sandwiches like these were a badge of resourcefulness. Wild game, stew, squirrel, rabbit, etc. When store-bought meat was too expensive and food stamps didn't go far enough, the woods became the butcher. Squirrel, rabbit, even groundhog or possum, all went into the pot. You cleaned the animal, skinned it, and chopped it into stew-ready pieces, then browned the meat in lard, tossed in chopped onions, a few root vegetables if you had them, and enough water or broth to cover. It simmered for hours, softening the meat and thickening the broth, until it smelled like something you'd been looking forward to all day. Served over cornbread, rice, or just in a bowl by itself, wild game stew was rich, wild, and slightly gamey, flavor that told you this wasn't grocery store food. This was caught, cleaned, and cooked the hard way. It wasn't fancy, but it was real, and it filled the belly like nothing else. Tomato sandwich. When the tomatoes were ripe and falling off the vine faster than they could be canned, the tomato sandwich reigned supreme. Thick, juicy slices of homegrown tomato, deep red and bursting with flavor, were laid across soft bread smeared with mayonnaise or butter. Salt and pepper crowned the top. That was it. It didn't pretend to be anything fancy, but in the heat of a southern summer, with sweat dripping and sunburn setting in, nothing tasted more alive. The tomato sandwich was seasonal salvation. It was the joy of growing your own food, the pride of a backyard garden feeding a family of 7. Kids came in from chores with sunburnt arms and dirt under their nails, and this was what waited on the table. Soggy bread, red juice running down fingers, the tang of salt and acid on the tongue. It was messy and marvelous. When meat was too expensive and store trips were rare, this sandwich filled the gap. It was cheap, abundant, and for a brief moment in August, tasted like luxury. People remembered it long after they could afford more. Lard fried bread with sugar. When butter ran out, lard stepped in. When jam and syrup were gone, sugar took their place. And when there wasn't much of anything else, you fried up slices of bread in hot lard, sprinkled sugar over the top, and called it dinner. The bread crisped at the edges and browned in the middle, soaking up the fat until it was golden and rich. The sugar melted just enough to form a crackling top layer that crunched between your teeth. You served it hot off the skillet, fingers greasy, faces sticky. It wasn't light, it wasn't healthy, but it was sweet, warm, and fast. Lard-fried bread with sugar was the kind of meal you made when you needed to give someone something to smile about and had almost nothing to work with. It didn't last long, not on the plate, not in memory. But for 5 minutes, it felt like a treat. Sweetened condensed milk sandwiches. There were nights when you didn't bother lighting the stove, when even heating something up felt like too much work for a body already worn thin by the day. That's when the sweetened condensed milk came out. A sticky can pulled from the back of the pantry, pried open with a dull knife if the can opener had gone missing again. You sliced open 2 pieces of white bread, stale, store brand, bought on sale, and poured the thick golden milk straight from the can onto the bread. No measuring, no spreading, just a slow, syrupy flood. You slapped the second piece of bread on top and ate it over the sink or standing by the counter, the milk running down your wrists, your mouth glued sweet shut. It wasn't healthy. It wasn't balanced. It was sugar and fat and survival packed into 2 trembling slices of bread. And somehow it made you feel full, even when everything else felt hollow. Sweetened, condensed milk sandwiches didn't need recipes. They didn't need silverware. They needed hunger, a little sweetness, and the stubbornness to find joy wherever you could. Sweet potato and onion hash. You peeled sweet potatoes by hand, rough and quick, the skins curling off onto the counter, diced them into rough cubes. Did the same with a couple onions, sharp, tear-inducing, but necessary. Into a heavy skillet they went, tossed into bacon grease or lard if you had it, into plain oil if you didn't. The sweet potatoes sizzled against the heat, their sugars caramelizing at the edges, while the onions melted into soft, golden strings. You stirred with a wooden spoon, scraping up the bits that stuck to the pan, smelling the sharpness of the onion, mixing with the earthiness of the potatoes. Salt and pepper came next, heavy shakes from old tin shakers. There wasn't any meat on the plate most nights, but nobody complained. Sweet potato and onion hash filled the kitchen with a heavy, rich smell, and it sat in your stomach like a promise that maybe tomorrow wouldn't be so lean. You piled it onto chipped plates, ate it hot, and scraped up every bit. Nothing fancy, nothing wasted, just potatoes, onions, and enough hope fried into every bite to carry you through. Flour dumplings in tomato juice. When the meat ran out, but the hunger didn't, flour dumplings in tomato juice filled the gap. It started with a pot of cheap tomato juice, poured straight from the can into a dented saucepan, thinned with a little water if you needed to stretch it. You brought the juice to a simmer, bubbling slow, smelling sharp and sour in the warm kitchen. Then came the dumplings, nothing but flour, salt, and a splash of water, stirred into a thick, heavy dough you could scoop up by the spoonful. You dropped rough lumps of dough straight into the boiling tomato broth. They floated up fat and lumpy, soaking in the juice, steaming in the heat. Some folks seasoned the broth with a little black pepper. Some added a dab of bacon grease or a crumbled bouillon cube, if they had one. Most just let it be, simple and sharp, the dumplings soft and chewy against the tangy broth. It wasn't a meal built for joy. It was a meal built to survive. Heavy dumplings, thin broth, and a little heat, enough to trick a growling stomach into silence for one more night. Mayonnaise and lettuce sandwiches. It was called a sandwich, but it was mostly a leaf and a prayer. You took a slice of iceberg, crunchy, cold, and barely green, and laid it on soft bread. Spread mayonnaise on both slices, just enough to make it feel like you had something creamy, something richer than you really did. You bit down through softness and crunch and told yourself it was fresh, light, maybe even good. Mayonnaise and lettuce sandwiches were summer meals for empty kitchens. They made the most of the produce drawer and the bottom of the mayo jar. And for a little while, they made you forget how little you had. Hot dog and potato hash. It was a scramble, a messy, glorious scramble of chopped hot dogs and diced potatoes fried hard in a big skillet, the potatoes browned and crisped at the edges, the hot dogs split and sizzled, their skins blistering in the heat. Sometimes an onion found its way into the pan. Sometimes a leftover scrap of cheese melted over the top if you had something fancy like that lying around. You piled it onto a plate, doused it with ketchup or mustard if you wanted, and ate standing up at the stove because sitting down took too long. Hot dog and potato hash wasn't a meal you planned. It was a meal you survived, and most nights that was good enough. Cornbread milk mush. Cornbread didn't die in a poor man's house. It lived again, reborn into something hot and heavy enough to be called supper. When the pans of yesterday's cornbread went hard and dry, you didn't toss them. You crumbled them into a bowl, thick hunks and fine crumbs alike, rough as the day that made them. You poured milk over the top, maybe fresh if the cow had been generous, maybe powdered and whisked thin if you were scraping by. Some stirred in a little sugar or salt. Others let the milk do its own softening work, seeping into the bread until it turned into a thick, warm mush. Some nights you ate it cold, standing at the counter, spoon scraping the bottom of the bowl for the last heavy bite. Other nights you warmed it on the stove until steam curled up from the pot, filling the kitchen with the faint smell of cooked corn and hope. Cornbread milk mush wasn't glamorous. It didn't sit pretty on a plate, but it kept your stomach from turning in on itself and gave you one more night of strength to fight through the next day's troubles. It wasn't just dinner, it was a lifeline. Peanut butter and syrup sandwiches. Sometimes dinner was 2 slices of white bread and whatever you could smear between them. Peanut butter and syrup sandwiches weren't glamorous, but they were fast, cheap, and just sweet enough to feel like you weren't scraping rock bottom. You spread a thick layer of peanut butter across the bread, then poured a ribbon of syrup over the top, Karo, maple, or homemade cane syrup, if you were lucky. Fold it together, and you had a sticky, salty sweet mess that hit the spot like nothing else. It was the kind of meal that didn't need heat, prep, or even a plate. You could eat it standing up, walking to work, or lying in bed after a long day. It filled your belly, gave you just enough sugar to forget what else was missing, and went down easy. Peanut butter and syrup sandwiches weren't about health or balance. They were about getting through, about feeding yourself with what was left in the pantry when everything else was gone. And somehow, they still tasted good enough to remember. Cornbread pancakes. Cornbread pancakes weren't a recipe you measured. They were a recipe you remembered because there was nothing else left in the kitchen. You took cornmeal, cheap, gritty, and honest, and stirred it with water, maybe a little salt if you still had any. No eggs, no milk, no butter, just the barest things that could stretch into food. You heated a cast iron skillet, slicked it with bacon grease if you had it, or just rubbed it with lard or oil. Then you dropped spoonfuls of batter straight into the sizzling pan. They spread out into ragged circles, edges bubbling and crisping before you flipped them over with a battered spatula or just the edge of a knife. They came off the skillet golden, hot, and smelling better than they had any right to. You ate them stacked up with a smear of sorghum syrup if you were lucky, or plain if you weren't. They soaked up whatever you poured over them, soft in the center, crunchy at the edges. Cornbread pancakes didn't pretend to be a feast. They were rough, fast, and filling, fuel to get you through one more day without breaking under the weight of it all. And somehow that was enough. Rice and butter with cinnamon sugar. It didn't matter if the pantry was bare and the neighbors were eating better. If you had a sack of rice, a stick of butter, and a battered tin of cinnamon sugar, you had dinner that could almost make you feel rich. You boiled the rice until it was tender, grains puffed and clinging together in a warm heap. While it steamed, you dropped in a knob of butter, big if the week was good, small if it wasn't, and let it melt slow, pooling at the bottom. You took a spoon, stirred it all together, then showered the rice with cinnamon and sugar until the air smelled sweeter than anything money could buy. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't meat and potatoes. But when you sat down with a bowl of it, steaming in your hands, every bite tasted like a quiet kind of victory. The butter made it rich, the cinnamon made it bright, and the sugar made it enough to keep the cold out and the tiredness away. Rice and butter with cinnamon sugar wasn't a dessert. It was survival made sweet, and it stuck to your ribs in a way no fancy dinner ever could. Apple butter sandwich, sweet and spreadable. Apple butter was often homemade during the fall harvest and sealed in jars that lined cellar shelves. When sugar was too expensive and store-bought jam was out of reach, apple butter offered flavor, sweetness, and comfort. Slathered on soft bread, white, brown, or cornbread, it made for a humble sandwich that tasted like autumn. Sometimes it was paired with peanut butter if you were lucky, but often it stood alone, brown and glossy and spiced with cinnamon or clove. This sandwich was especially common in rural America, where families stretched what they canned and bartered what they didn't grow. Apple butter was made in giant pots, stirred with wooden paddles, then saved like gold. It showed up in school lunches, on road trips, and in worn brown bags, carried to field jobs. It wasn't filling in the traditional sense, but it fed something deeper. The sweetness, the connection to the land, the knowledge that someone's hands had stirred it for hours. In a time of scarcity, this sandwich wasn't just food. It was a reminder that something sweet could still be made from the hard labor of the land. Onion soup with croutons and broth. You took 3 onions, not because you wanted to, but because that's all you had. You sliced them thin, fried them low and slow in a little butter or oil until they went golden and soft. Then you added broth, real if you had it, bouillon if you didn't. Let it simmer until the house smelled like something worth remembering. Meanwhile, you toasted old bread, cubed it rough, and dropped it into bowls. The soup got ladled over the top, the bread soaking in until it barely held together. No cheese, no frills, just onions, broth, and the taste of getting by. And for that night, that was enough. Dandelion greens with vinegar. Nobody planted dandelions. They just grew, and when money was tight, that made them the most reliable crop around. Dandelion greens were bitter, wild, and free. And when boiled and dressed with vinegar, they became dinner. You picked them young, before the leaves turned tough and angry. gave them a good wash to get the dirt and bugs out, then boiled them down until they wilted into a deep green tangle. Some folks fried a bit of bacon or salt pork for flavor. Others just added a splash of vinegar and hoped it was enough. The taste was sharp, earthy, and strong. It hit your mouth like a warning and went down like a challenge. But it filled you, and it reminded you that nature didn't care about the price of groceries. If you were willing to look low, it would feed you. Served with cornbread or a slice of white bread, dandelion greens with vinegar was never anyone's favorite meal, but it was there when you needed it. And in hard times, that made it special. Mustard sandwiches. 2 slices of bread, a smear of mustard. That was it. But when that was all there was, it was enough. You spread it thick, yellow, and sharp over whatever bread you had, fresh, stale, or halfway to toast. Folded it over, or ate it open-faced, maybe with a shake of salt if you needed more flavor. There was no protein, no side dish, just bite after bite of tang and chew. Mustard sandwiches weren't meals you planned. They were meals that happened when payday didn't. And somehow they carried you to the next one. It wasn't about taste. It was about not giving up. Hard-boiled egg and vinegar sandwiches, properly expanded. When the meat was gone and payday was still too far away, you reached for the egg carton and the vinegar bottle. Hard-boiled egg and vinegar sandwiches weren't fancy, but they were fast, cheap, and just good enough to feel like real food. You boiled the eggs hard, no runny yolks, no careful timing. Just a full rolling boil until they were chalky and firm. Peeled them quick, crushed them rough with a fork, and stirred in a heavy splash of vinegar to wake them up. The vinegar made the eggs sing, sharp and clean, cutting through the heavy yolk like a hot knife. You pile the mixture onto slices of bread, sometimes adding a pinch of salt, maybe a crack of pepper if the jar wasn't empty. The bread soaked up the vinegar, softening just enough to hold everything together. It wasn't elegant, but it was rich with flavor and heavy enough to quiet a stomach gnawing from too many lean nights. Hard-boiled egg and vinegar sandwiches didn't pretend to be anything they weren't. They were sour, strong, and stubborn as the people who made them. And every bite carried a promise. You were still standing, and you were still eating. Rice pudding as dinner. When meat ran out and vegetables were too expensive, rice pudding stepped in, sweet, heavy, and warm. It was one of the few dinners that felt like a treat when you had nothing left to treat yourself with. You boiled white rice until soft, then stirred in milk, sugar, and maybe a pinch of salt. If the cupboards were kind, you added cinnamon or a handful of raisins. If they weren't, you made do. You let the mixture simmer low until it thickened into a creamy, sticky comfort, something between a dessert and a survival plan. Sometimes an egg went in to make it richer. Most times it didn't. You spooned it into bowls and ate it slow, letting the warmth settle into your bones. Rice pudding didn't care that it was dinner. It just did the job, filling you up with something soft, sweet, and simple enough to remind you there was still goodness in the world. And when you scraped the bottom of the pot, you didn't feel cheated. You felt full. Canned sardines on crackers. You didn't need a stove to make this meal, just a can opener, a stack of saltines, and an empty stomach. Canned sardines on crackers were the kind of dinner you could fix with one hand while the other rubbed the exhaustion out of your face. You peeled back the lid on the tiny tin, briny fish packed tight in oil or mustard sauce, and spooned them straight onto the crackers, one fillet at a time. Some people mashed them. Some ate them whole. Either way, they brought salt, fat, and protein to a plate that didn't have much else. If you had a slice of onion, you added it. If you had a splash of hot sauce, you drizzled. But most nights it was just fish, crackers, and quiet chewing. It wasn't pretty, but it didn't need to be. Sardines didn't apologize for their smell or their shine. They just fed you, fast and full, when the fridge was empty and the pantry echoed. Canned sardines on crackers weren't a delicacy. They were a defense against going to bed hungry. And for a lot of folks, that was more than enough. Oatmeal and bacon. Fat. There were nights when you didn't have sugar. No brown sugar, no syrup, no honey. Just a sack of oats and the old coffee tin of saved bacon grease by the stove. You boiled water, poured in the oats, and stirred until they thickened into something heavy and plain. Then you scooped in a spoonful of bacon fat, greasy, smoky, salted from breakfasts long gone, and stirred until the whole pot took on the flavor of better days. It wasn't sweet, it wasn't delicate, it was salty, hearty, and heavy enough to anchor a man to the ground through another freezing morning. You didn't dress it up. You ate it straight, bowl in one hand, spoon in the other, standing at the kitchen counter if the table was already piled with unpaid bills. Oatmeal with bacon fat wasn't a meal you made because you liked it. It was the meal you made because it stayed in your gut like armor. It was heavy and plain and real, and it kept you going when there wasn't much else to hold you up. Egg drop soup with scraps. This wasn't a recipe, it was a last stand. When all you had was a broth base, a couple vegetables, and one egg, you made egg drop soup. Water and bouillon made the broth. Maybe there was a real chicken carcass left from Sunday. More often, it was just hot, salty liquid with a few scraps of onion, celery, or carrots tossed in from the back of the icebox. The egg was the magic. Whisked in a bowl, then poured slowly into the boiling broth while stirring, it turned into silky ribbons that swirled around like something elegant. A dash of pepper gave it bite. A little vinegar or soy sauce if someone had traveled far enough to pick some up. Served in mugs or soup bowls or whatever was clean, it didn't look like much. But it was warm, nourishing, and felt, just for a moment, like a real meal. And sometimes that moment was enough. Buttered noodles with black pepper. When money got tight and the day was long, buttered noodles with pepper was the meal that answered back. Boil pasta, any kind. Drain it, drop in a stick of butter, or however much was left, and stir until every noodle was coated and shiny. Then hit it with the black pepper. A lot of black pepper. No cheese, no sauce. Just butter, heat, and pepper, sharp enough to make your mouth pay attention. Served in a bowl, eaten with a spoon, and maybe chased with a piece of bread, it didn't pretend to be anything but what it was. Simple, fast, and filling. Exactly what you needed at the end of the kind of day you didn't want to talk about. Apple cider vinegar stew. This was depression food, sour, simple, and stronger than it looked. Apple cider vinegar stew started with whatever root vegetables you had, potatoes, onions, carrots. You peeled what needed peeling, chopped it all coarse, and threw it into a pot with water and a splash of cider vinegar. The vinegar cut through everything, brought brightness to the broth, and made up for the absence of meat. Sometimes there was a scrap of bacon or salt pork. Sometimes just a bay leaf or a clove of garlic. Most of the time it was the vegetables, the vinegar, and a long boil that made it something worth eating. You served it hot, ladled into bowls, and eaten with a spoon scraped across the bottom. It wasn't rich, but it was honest. It woke up your tongue, warmed your stomach, and reminded you that a little bite could be a blessing. White gravy and biscuits. Some days all you had was flour, grease, and a few scraps of baking powder to rub together into something that looked like dinner. White gravy and biscuits didn't need anything else. You stirred bacon fat or lard into a bubbling skillet, whisked in flour until it turned the color of toast, and then thinned it with water or milk into a thick, creamy flood of pure, peppery survival. The biscuits didn't need to be pretty, just rough mounds of dough baked until they barely held together, perfect for soaking up every drop of that heavy, salty gravy. It wasn't about indulgence. It was about hunger, about making sure nobody went to bed empty, about knowing that sometimes a plate of bread and sauce was enough to carry you through whatever the world had lined up next. Fried green tomato sandwiches. When the tomatoes were still hard and green on the vine but couldn't wait any longer, you sliced them thick, dredged them in cornmeal, and dropped them into a hot skillet. They sizzled in bacon grease or lard, browning fast on the outside while the inside softened just enough to bite. The edges crisped, the middle stayed tart, and the smell filled the house with something that felt better than it cost. You laid the hot slices between two pieces of white bread, maybe with a smear of mayo, if there was any left in the jar. Some folks added lettuce. Most just pressed the sandwich together while the tomatoes were still spitting heat and juice. It didn't look fancy, and it didn't last long on the plate. Fried green tomato sandwiches were born from impatience, necessity, and the knowledge that even unripe food had value if you treated it right. In homes where the garden fed the table and the paycheck didn't always arrive, this was a meal that reminded you the backyard could feed you just as well as any grocery store. Stuffed bell peppers with rice, no meat version. Stuffed peppers without meat sounded like a punishment. But when times got tough, rice stepped up and carried the weight. You boiled up a pot of white rice, soft but not mushy, stirred in diced onions, maybe a spoonful of tomato paste or leftover sauce from the back of the fridge, a sprinkle of salt, pepper, and if the garden was good to you, some chopped herbs or a bit of garlic. You cut the tops off the bell peppers, green, red, whatever was cheapest, and hollowed them out like little bowls, packed them full of rice mix, and stood them upright in a baking dish. A splash of water or tomato sauce at the bottom kept them from drying out. Baked until the peppers softened and the tops crisped just a little, they came out smelling better than anything made from scraps had a right to. No meat, no cheese, just a pepper filled with hope and starch. And sometimes that was the best thing on the table. Fried apples and biscuits. You peeled and sliced the apples thin, tossed them in a skillet with butter, or bacon grease if that's all you had, and sprinkled sugar over the top like a memory. They fried down slow, turning golden and soft, the sugar bubbling into syrup, and the fruit collapsing into sweet, sticky ribbons. Meanwhile, you baked up a batch of biscuits from scratch, just flour, lard, baking powder, and water if that was all the pantry allowed. They came out uneven but hot, split down the middle, and steaming. You spooned the fried apples right on top, let the syrup soak in, ate it with your hands or a fork, depending on how tired the day had made you. It wasn't breakfast, it wasn't dessert, it was just food, sweet, simple, and so good it almost made you forget how little was in the icebox. Fried apples and biscuits reminded you that comfort didn't need cost. It needed heat, time, and a little sugar. Prune sandwich. Yes, prunes. Those wrinkled little fruit grenades that kids today associate with digestion and old folks. But 50 to 70 years ago, a prune sandwich wasn't weird. It was practical. especially if Grandma had a jar of stewed prunes cooling on the stove. The syrupy sweetness soaked into a piece of soft bread. Then a few soft, mashed prunes were spooned on and smashed between the slices. Sometimes butter was added to cut the sweetness, sometimes cinnamon. Often nothing at all. This was sugar when sugar was scarce. It was a child's after-school snack or a quick breakfast for a father running late to the mill. Prunes were affordable, available in bulk, and didn't go bad easily. They were sweet enough to pass as dessert and heavy enough to calm a grumbling stomach. To modernize, it's hard to imagine putting prunes in a sandwich and calling it lunch. But to people who made everything stretch, who preserved fruit in cellars and reused wax paper until it fell apart, it was a small luxury wrapped in practicality, sweet, sticky, and stained into memory. Noodle and ketchup skillet. This wasn't spaghetti. This was survival. You boiled a handful of dry noodles, elbows, egg noodles, whatever was cheapest, and when they were soft, you drained them and dumped them back into the skillet. Then came the ketchup, not sauce, ketchup. Squeezed straight from the bottle, stirred in until the noodles turned red and slippery. A pinch of salt, maybe a little pepper. Some folks added chopped onion, if they had it, or a cube of butter to smooth it out. You let it sizzle for a minute, the ketchup caramelizing just enough to smell like something more than what it was. It hit the plate hot, sweet, and tangy. It wasn't trying to taste like Italian food. It wasn't trying to taste like anything but enough. Noodle and ketchup skillet didn't pretend. It filled the belly and stretched the budget. And for families who didn't have meat or cheese or even a can of tomato sauce, it got the job done. Potato cakes with onion. It started with leftovers, the kind nobody really wanted until you gave them a second life. Cold, mashed potatoes, stiff from the fridge, got dumped into a bowl and mixed with chopped onion, a little flour, maybe an egg if you could spare one. You shaped the mixture into heavy patties and dropped them into a hot skillet, greased with whatever fat was left. The outside crisped golden brown, forming a crust that cracked when your fork hit it. Inside, the potatoes turned creamy again, the onions soft and sweet. You didn't need toppings. No ketchup, no sour cream. Just a stack of hot cakes on a plate and the steam rising to meet you. Some nights they were breakfast. Some nights dinner. Sometimes both. They didn't last long on the table, and they didn't need help to taste like comfort. Potato cakes with onion reminded you that even the things people thought were done, cold, unwanted, forgotten, could come back better than before. All they needed was a little heat and someone willing to try. Salt pork and beans. Salt pork and beans was more than a meal. It was a method. You soaked the dried beans overnight, not because it was fancy cooking, but because the beans were stubborn and needed convincing. Come morning, they went into a big pot with slabs of salt pork, fatty, meaty, salty cuts that were closer to preservation than indulgence. As the pot simmered low and slow, the salt pork broke down, melting its flavor into every bean. The smell filled the house and stuck to the walls, thick, smoky, a scent that promised something worth waiting for. You didn't rush it. You let the beans get soft, the broth thicken, and the salt pork turn tender enough to fall apart under your spoon. Some folks added onions, a pinch of sugar, maybe some black pepper or molasses if the cupboard was generous. It came to the table with nothing but a slice of cornbread or white bread to soak up the juices. It wasn't delicate. It was tough, salty, and heavy in the best way. Salt pork and beans didn't just fill a plate. It filled a family, a work day, a week, and in hard times, that meant everything. dried apple, and rice bake. This was a pantry dish, built from things that didn't go bad, even when everything else did. You boiled rice until tender, then folded in a handful of dried apples, chopped rough, a little sugar, a bit of cinnamon, and a spoonful of lard or butter turned it into something that almost felt like dessert. You poured it into a baking dish, baked it until the top set and the apples softened, then spooned it into bowls while it was still warm. It wasn't a flashy meal. It was quiet, simple, and sweet in a way that stuck with you. Dried apple and rice bake was what you made when you wanted comfort, but the store was too far, and the money was too short. And when you sat down to eat it, spoon in hand, it tasted like home. Navy bean soup with salt pork. This wasn't a soup for sipping. It was a soup for working. Thick, salty, and heavy. Navy bean soup was built to keep you going when the pantry and paycheck were both running dry. You soaked the beans overnight, softened them up, then dropped them into a deep pot with chunks of salt pork, cheap, fatty cuts that gave up all their flavor as they simmered. Onions and maybe a carrot went in too. Garlic, if you had it. But it was the salt pork that made the difference. Melting down, fat rendering into the broth, meat turning tender. It cooked for hours. By the end, the beans were soft, the broth was golden, and the smell filled the whole house like a promise. You served it thick with cornbread, if you had it, or just a torn-off slice of white bread to chase it down. Navy bean soup didn't waste anything. It didn't pretend. It just showed up hot, hearty, and ready to do the job. Canned tamale pie. It came out of a box, a can, or a desperate idea, and sometimes all three. Canned tamale pie was the last-minute hero of dinner tables that had more mouths than money. You browned what little ground beef you had, stirred in a can of corn, a can of tomatoes or chili beans, and maybe a dash of cumin or chili powder if the spice rack wasn't empty. That mixture went into a baking dish, bubbling and loud. Then came the topping, boxed cornbread mix, poured right over the top, thick enough to seal it in and fluffy enough to make it feel special. Baked until golden on top and steaming at the edges, tamale pie sliced like a casserole and ate like a hot meal should. Fast, easy, and filling. No one asked what kind of meat was in it. No one complained it wasn't real tamales. They just ate it, smiled, and came back for seconds. Dried beef gravy over rice. Dried beef gravy over rice wasn't just dinner. It was an invention born out of bare pantries and tighter wallets. You started with a tiny jar of dried beef, salty and stiff, torn into shreds or rough slices because nobody wasted time with neatness when they were this hungry. You dropped it into a hot pan with a lump of lard, bacon grease, or butter, whatever was closest to hand. The beef crackled for a moment, waking up in the fat, before you stirred in a big spoonful of flour and cooked it into a dark roux. Then came the milk, poured slow, stirred hard, scraping up every scrap from the pan bottom. The gravy thickened quick, going from pale to heavy. The beef softening inside it, surrendering its salt and smoke into the sauce. Meanwhile, a pot of rice boiled on the back burner, each grain puffing up, white and forgiving. You ladled that thick, salty gravy over a mound of rice so big it barely fit on the plate. It wasn't delicate. It was a survival disguised as something rich. You didn't think about tomorrow's meals while eating it. You just kept spooning it into your mouth until the hollow feeling was finally gone. Hardtack and butter. Hardtack wasn't food you made because you wanted to. It was food you made because you had no other choice. A brick of flour, water, and salt baked until it was dry enough to survive a war. Hardtack lived longer than the people who made it. When there wasn't meat, when there wasn't soup, and when there wasn't even a can of beans left in the pantry, you reached for hardtack. You cracked it open if you were strong enough, softened it, in coffee or milk if you weren't, and spread butter, real, rancid, or substitute, over the jagged top to make it something almost edible. The butter soaked into the cracks, softened the chew a little, and gave it a richness that your tongue craved after too many lean meals. Sometimes you dipped it into hot broth to make it manageable. Other times you ate it as it was, dry and dense, grinding it down with tired teeth. Hardtack and butter wasn't dinner for those who wanted luxury. It was dinner for those who understood that a full stomach, even one filled with a meal older than the clothes on your back, was still a blessing worth fighting for. Milk toast, bread, and hot milk. There was nothing fancy about milk toast. It was the kind of meal you made when your body needed warmth and your wallet was empty. It started with stale bread, soft white slices that had seen better days. You toasted them lightly if the stove worked, or just tore them into pieces if it didn't. Meanwhile, you warmed a pan of milk, whole if you had it, watered down if you didn't, stirring slow so it wouldn't scorch. A pinch of salt, maybe a dab of butter, or a shake of sugar, depending on what kind of night it had been. Once the milk was hot, you poured it straight over the bread in a bowl, letting it soak in and soften everything until it was more comfort than food. It was quiet, it was plain, and it went down easy. For sick days, end-of-month nights, or just when there wasn't much else to eat, milk toast did the job. It warmed your hands, it calmed your stomach, and it reminded you that sometimes survival didn't look like a feast. It looked like a bowl of hot milk poured over bread, and that was good enough. Onion and tomato salad with bread. Sometimes all the garden gave you was onions and tomatoes, and when that happened, you didn't curse it. You built dinner from it. You sliced thick slabs of tomato, the juice running onto the counter, staining everything it touched, peeled and sliced onions so sharp they stung your eyes, tossed both into a big bowl, hit them with a glug of vinegar or oil if there was any to spare, and seasoned with salt and black pepper like you meant it. The bread was day-old, hard around the edges, but you tore it into pieces and let it soak up the juices at the bottom of the bowl. Each bite was a slap of acid, sweet and sharp at the same time, softened by the bread soaking up the life of the vegetables. You didn't set a table for it. You didn't need a knife and fork, just a bowl in your lap, a spoon in your hand, and a hunger that didn't care about fancy cooking. Onion and tomato salad with bread didn't fill you up the way meat would, but it fed something deeper, the memory of sunlight, of dirt under your nails, of survival pulled straight out of stubborn ground. Cabbage and potato soup. You didn't need much to make cabbage and potato soup, just a pot, a flame, and the will to keep moving. You peeled and chopped the potatoes, rough and quick. Then came the cabbage, shredded by hand or knife into thick, wrinkled strips. You dropped everything into a big pot of salted water or thin broth. Let it boil until the cabbage softened and the potatoes cracked open just enough to cloud the liquid. Onion, if you had it. A clove of garlic, if you were lucky. But the heart of it was always the same. A cheap, honest meal that filled a bowl and stuck to your ribs. Served with stale bread or nothing at all, cabbage and potato soup reminded you that the line between survival and comfort was thinner than people think. It didn't win awards. It didn't need seasoning secrets. It just needed to be hot, heavy, and ready by the time the sun went down. Macaroni and milk. Macaroni and milk was about as bare-boned as comfort food came. You boiled macaroni until soft, drained it, and poured milk over it, just enough to keep it from feeling dry, just enough to feel like something warm and complete. A bit of butter, if you had it, a pinch of salt. Some people added pepper, some added sugar. Most did whatever their grandmother taught them to do. You didn't bake it. You didn't dress it up. You just stirred it and served it. It came to the table hot and bland, but there was something soothing in that. It didn't ask anything of you but a spoon and an appetite. Macaroni and milk was what you made when groceries were low and spirits were lower. It was soft, cheap, and filling, a blank page you could survive on. And when you had more again, you remembered how this little bowl had carried you through the worst of it. Cornmeal dumplings in broth. When the cupboard was nearly bare and soup alone wasn't enough, cornmeal dumplings turned thin broth into something that could hold you over. You brought water or stock to a boil, sometimes with scraps of onion, maybe a bone, or bit of meat from a previous meal. Into that went the dumplings. Cornmeal stirred with salt, a little lard or bacon grease, and just enough water to hold together. You dropped spoonfuls of the thick batter right into the bubbling liquid. They swelled up slow, soaking in the flavor and turning soft in the middle, firm at the edges. It was humble food, built to stretch, the kind of meal that didn't fill your plate, but filled your belly. Cornmeal dumplings weren't about flavor fireworks. They were about survival, patience, and the quiet kind of resourcefulness passed down from someone who never once wasted a bite. Mayonnaise sandwich. It was desperation in its purest form. When the fridge was almost empty and the pantry had been picked clean, the mayonnaise jar was the last soldier standing. A mayonnaise sandwich wasn't dressed up. It didn't pretend. It was 2 slices of plain bread, often drying out at the edges, spread with a slippery pale layer of mayo. Some added black pepper for a hint of life. Others toasted the bread to give it crunch. But the core of it was the same: fat, blandness, and the soft squish of emptiness. Kids often ate it after school while waiting for dinner that might never come. It was a lunchbox filler and a midnight snack when paychecks were still days away. It left the mouth coated and the conscience quiet, because it meant no one was starving, not tonight. And somehow the tang of mayonnaise lingered like a ghost in the kitchen, reminding everyone of the line between getting by and going under. People laughed about it later in life. But in the moment, there was nothing funny. It was a sandwich that meant survival, and survival was sometimes the only victory a family could claim. Onion and tomato salad with bread. When the garden was all you had left, you ate what it gave you, and often that meant tomatoes and onions, sharp, juicy, simple. You sliced them thick, the onions biting back tears, the tomatoes bleeding juice all over the counter. Toss them together with salt, pepper, and a drizzle of vinegar or oil if you had it. If not, the juices alone did the work. You laid the mixture onto thick slices of bread, or used the bread to soak up the puddle of juice at the bottom of the bowl. It wasn't salad, the way fancy restaurants talked about salad. It was survival in a bowl, sharp, refreshing, and just heavy enough to remind you you were still standing. Onion and tomato salad with bread wasn't built for presentation. It was built for hot kitchens with fans in the windows and not much else in the icebox. And somehow, on the right summer evening, it tasted like the richest thing in the world. Tuna noodle casserole, heavy on noodles. It was never about the tuna. It was about making 1 can of fish stretch over a whole pan of noodles and come out tasting like something someone might call a casserole. You boiled egg noodles, drained them, and stirred in canned cream of mushroom soup, a splash of milk, and 1 lone can of tuna, drained and flaked to disappear evenly through the mix. Some folks added peas or shredded cheese if they had it. Most didn't. Everything got dumped into a baking dish and topped with crushed crackers, breadcrumbs, or whatever could add a bit of crunch. Baked until golden, tuna noodle casserole wasn't flashy, but it was warm, soft, and predictable. Three things you clung to when the world outside the oven wasn't. Cold meatloaf sandwiches. Meatloaf always got better the second day, once the fat firmed up and the seasoning settled into every bite. Cold meatloaf sandwiches were about making yesterday's scraps into today's prize. You cut thick slices straight from the fridge, slapped them onto white bread, and squirted a heavy line of mustard across the top. No fancy toasters, no fancy sauces, just meat, bread, and whatever dignity you could scrape together on a Tuesday morning. Sometimes a slice of onion made it into the sandwich. Sometimes just a pickle on the side. Either way, it was sturdy, heavy, and enough to keep you moving until quitting time. Hominy and salt. Hominy wasn't glamorous. It didn't dress up the plate. It didn't even pretend to be exciting. But it stuck to your ribs, and in a world where food had to work as hard as you did, that was all anyone asked for. You cracked open a big can or boiled dried hominy if you were lucky enough to have the patience. You dumped it into a pot, salted it heavy, and simmered it until the kernels swelled soft and fragrant. Some nights you fried it crisp in bacon grease. Other nights you just ate it as it came, a big steaming bowl of chewy, salty corn. No butter, no pepper, just heat, salt, and stubbornness. It didn't taste like much, but it filled you. It coated your stomach in warmth and starch and got you through the nights when the wind howled too hard and the workday stretched too long. Hominy and salt wasn't a meal you bragged about. It was a meal you remembered because it showed up when nothing else did and when every bite mattered more than anything else in the world. Bologna boats with melted cheese. If you were hungry and broke and had 5 minutes to get dinner on the table, bologna boats had your back. You started with thick-cut slices of bologna, the cheaper, the better, laid flat on a baking sheet. Once they hit the heat, the edges curled up into little bowls, perfect for holding whatever scraps you had. Most nights it was just a scoop of shredded cheese, cheddar, American, or even broken up slices from a crumpled wrapper. You dropped it right in the middle and let it melt until it bubbled and browned, the fat from the bologna sizzling into the tray. If you had crushed crackers, leftover mashed potatoes, or a dollop of mustard, those went in too. But even plain, the smell was enough to bring the whole house to the kitchen. Served with a spoonful of slaw, canned green beans, or nothing at all, bologna boats didn't apologize for what they were. They were salty, greasy, and full of character. Dinner on a dime, comfort without credentials. And when you took that first bite, crunchy edges and molten center, you didn't care how much money you didn't have. It just tasted good. Rice and butter with cinnamon sugar. Sometimes dinner came in the form of a dessert that didn't know it was a dessert. You boiled rice till it was soft and tender, drained it, and while it was still hot, stirred in a big slab of butter until every grain gleamed. Then came the cinnamon and sugar, shaken from old tins, sprinkled with a heavy hand, until the air smelled sweet enough to trick your body into thinking you were celebrating something. You didn't plate it fancy. You didn't bake it. You scooped it into bowls and ate it steaming hot, the sugar melting into syrupy puddles at the bottom. Rice and butter with cinnamon sugar wasn't filling like meat and potatoes. It didn't stick like beans and bread, but it gave you a sense of comfort that sometimes mattered more. It warmed you from the inside out, made you sit a little taller at the dinner table, even if the pantry behind you was nearly bare. It wasn't about being full. It was about remembering what a little sweetness could do to a tired heart. Split pea soup with ham hocks. Split pea soup didn't care what day of the week it was. It was cheap, thick, and hot. And if you had a ham hock to throw in the pot, you were eating better than most. You started with dried green peas, rinsed clean, and boiled low and slow with onions, garlic, maybe a chopped carrot, if there was one, lying around. The ham hock went in whole, bone and all, bringing fat, smoke, and salt to every corner of the broth. Hours passed, and the peas melted into a creamy stew. The meat softened until it slid off the bone in rich, chewy shreds. Some folks added potatoes. Some didn't. Either way, it came to the table thick enough to stand a spoon in. You served it with crusty bread or just ate it out of a chipped bowl in silence. It didn't need sides. It didn't need help. Split pea soup with ham hocks wasn't pretty, but it was dependable, it was filling, and it turned the cheapest bag of legumes into something worth scraping every drop from the pot. Boiled potatoes with butter and onions. If you had potatoes, you had dinner. Boil them whole or chopped, skins on or off, whatever time and energy allowed. Melt butter in a pan. Fry up a chopped onion until it went soft and golden. Drain the potatoes, throw them in, smash them gently with a fork, and let them soak up everything. Some folks added salt, others added pepper. A few tossed in whatever herbs were growing wild out back. Served hot, it was a one-pan meal that smelled like home and tasted like you were doing okay, even when the cupboards told a different story.